Okay, so welcome to the next installment of Schizophrenia and its Treatment. And we are very excited to be here on the grounds of Connecticut Valley Hospital. Connecticut Valley Hospital plays a very large role in our story today. And in fact, Connecticut Valley Hospital is one of the most well-known centers for the treatment of severe psychiatric illness. In thinking about the history of diagnosis and the treatment of schizophrenia, one needs to go back to the early Greeks and Romans. Among the early Greeks and Romans, there were writings that indicated that there were ideas about phenomena such as mania and melancholia. It's unclear whether mania meant the same thing that it means to us today in terms of excess energy, flight of ideas, agitation. And there's some unclarity as to whether melancholia would mean what we think of today as being a type of clinical depression. But nonetheless, it's clear that in ancient Greek and Roman writings, there was a clear depiction of what would appear to be psychiatric illness. A lot of this work can be traced to two major figures, Hippocrates and Galen. Hippocrates had formulated the humoral theory of medical illness. By this formula, or this approach to understanding medical illness, there were four humors. The four humors consisted of black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And the idea was that these four humors worked together to create, when in balance, a healthy state. There was some thought that among the ancient Greeks and Romans, that they actually posited the idea that an aberration of these humors, that is when these humors sort of went out of balance, one could get syndromes that could be likened to mental illness. But again, this is a long time ago, and it remains unclear whether they were thinking about mental illness in the same way that we think about the symptoms of mental illness. We do know that by the 6th century AD, in many of these, among many Greek philosophers, there was an idea that the study of humans could be part of the natural world, that the study of humans were subject to the same laws as the rest of the natural world. And as a function of that idea, there began to be an analysis of human behavior and human mind. The ideas about these humors, these four humors and their balance of these four humors carried all the way into the Middle Ages. So when you get into the 1500s, the 1600s, those ideas still persisted and were often used as an explanation for unusual or aberrant behavior. We know that in the early periods of the founding of America, that there was one major figure in the history of understanding severe mental illness, and that's Benjamin Rush, who's in fact considered to be the father of American psychiatry, and actually was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Rush, who was really a polymath, he wrote one of the first textbooks on chemistry. He also was among the first, or was actually the first, to actually write a formal textbook in 1812 called Diseases of the Mind, which focused on different psychiatric disorders. What's interesting about this book, and what's clear about early American psychiatry, is the idea that diagnosis was based purely on description. That is, diagnosis was based on specific symptoms and then naming those symptoms as different disorders. So for example, Benjamin Rush in his early textbook, Diseases of the Mind, actually makes reference to something called wedding night madness or wedding night lunacy. And this is the idea that on a wedding night, after people were married for the first time, they could come down with some severe sort of psychiatric disturbance. And there were any number, there were literally hundreds of different diagnoses in his textbook, Diseases of the Mind. Having this as sort of a background, as we move into the 1800s and into the early 1900s, there was a shift in diagnosis that went from describing mental illnesses as consisting primarily of descriptions of individual symptoms towards trying to come up with a coherent model of how these different symptoms might be caused by a core disease entity. This idea of a core disease entity was driven by a couple factors in psychiatric illness. And one of the key findings that argued for sort of a central causative mechanism in mental illness was the discovery of Alzheimer's disease. And this occurred in the late 1800s in Germany, where they began to actually do post-mortem analysis of brain tissue of people who during their life had suffered from memory problems, disorientation. And it was determined that there was a very characteristic neuropathology that was subsequently called Alzheimer's disease. Another major factor that led to this idea that there could be a central causative factor that would be explaining many of the symptoms of psychiatric illness was related to the discovery of the cause of neurosyphilis. Syphilis was a very common sexually transmitted disease in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And some historians of psychiatry have actually argued that as many as a fifth of the admits to psychiatric hospitals in the late 1800s to the early 1900s were in fact people suffering from neurosyphilis. Neurosyphilis had a very characteristic sort of progression. So after a period of quiescence for about a decade, it would enter the central nervous system and begin to cause symptoms of agitation, sometimes delusions, hallucinations, and then eventually, typically, the patient would pass away. This characteristic pattern of symptoms that was subsequently determined to be caused by a single microorganism, Treponema pallidum, led researchers to begin to think that these, what appear to be very discordant symptoms in psychiatric illness, might in fact be caused by a single causative agent. So these two factors, again, the discovery of Alzheimer's disease on the one hand, through postmortem analysis of brain tissue, and on the other hand, the finding that a microorganism could cause what appeared to be a very diverse set of psychiatric symptoms that led people to think that perhaps rather than describing many different types of symptoms as separate disorders, perhaps it would be good to categorize central kinds or types of disorders. It's in this spirit that the work of Kraepelin can be understood. And we've talked about Kraepelin already in the course. Kraepelin was the first person to really define the syndrome that we think of as schizophrenia. He named it as dementia praecox, and this was named in the 5th edition of his textbook in 1896. And in this textbook, when he described the disorder, he was taking individuals with many different psychiatric symptoms. Some had delusions, some had hallucinations, some had social withdrawal, and he put them together into this broader kind or category, which he called dementia praecox. He defined these disorders based on the outcome of the disorder. He was very interested in looking at the trajectory of disorders over time. And he defined dementia praecox as a psychiatric illness that typically got worse over time. That was sort of his model of it. He had note cards in his clinic at Munich and at Heidelberg. And in his clinic, he would see literally hundreds of patients, would write up these note cards, and found that there was a group of symptoms consisting of delusions and hallucinations that he called dementia praecox. This idea of dementia praecox, of course, preceded our subsequent ideas of schizophrenia. In terms of this, Connecticut Valley Hospital is actually a very important place for us to be describing this history, because Connecticut Valley Hospital is actually one of the first hospitals to, in a large way, start applying this new diagnosis of dementia praecox that had come over from Germany. There were two major emigre psychiatrists here in America who really promoted the idea of these central kinds or types of psychiatric illness. The two were Adolf Meyer and August Hock. Adolf Meyer is a Swiss psychiatrist who had actually trained directly under Emil Kraepelin at the University of Heidelberg. He learned about Kraepelin's approach to diagnostic classification, and he brought it to the US. He was based at Worcester State Hospital, was the director of pathology there, and from that position, he began describing this new categorization of psychiatric illness. At the same time, and this is around 1898, 1899, there was a new superintendent here at Connecticut Valley Hospital, which at the time was called the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane. And that new director was Charles Page. And in fact, the building behind me is actually named after Charles Page, who was a superintendent of the hospital at that time. Page was extremely impressed with these new diagnostic classifications and began to actually have his staff here at the hospital apply these classifications to clients who were hospitalized here. This classification led between the years of 1898 to 2000, and this is a historical work done by the psychologist Richard Knoll, in which he's described, or looking through records, has found that in fact the diagnosis of dementia praecox, which did not even exist prior to 1898 at Connecticut Valley Hospital, suddenly emerged to describe over 30% of the clients hospitalized here at Connecticut Valley. So there was this huge change in diagnostic classification system, whereas before the diagnosis of dementia praecox had not even existed. Within a period of 2 years, a third of the hospital was diagnosed now with this new disorder, which again is sort of the predecessor to what we think of as schizophrenia.